It was a cold day in late autumn when I hiked through the Canadian escarpment. Most of the leaves had already fallen to the ground in preparation for winter. The escarpment was eerily silent, except for a couple crows that squawked at me from the barren branches above. The brilliance of autumn had since faded into various shades of brown, and the hushed landscape was all but spent of color. But some color remained, and will linger until winter comes to wipe the slate entirely clean for another year. There were pockets of green, moss that clung to the rock walls, and ferns which stood against the trees. It had rained often in recent days, which made the emerald hue of the moss and ferns only burn brighter against the pale stillness. I decided it was time to build a small fire so that I could make some white cedar tea. The fire would warm me up on the outside, while the tea would warm me up from the inside. But first I would need to collect some good tinder. Considering that everything was cold and damp, I knew that most tinders weren't going to cut it for making a fire. In the past, I've experimented with various kinds of common tinders, such as cattail fluff and cedar bark shavings, with varied results. But when things are cold and or wet, I always use birch bark. Here's 4 reasons why. Number 1, birch bark is available all year round. Number 2, in my area, it is a very common tree. Whenever I go on a hike, I'm almost guaranteed to come across at least one birch tree. Number 3, it's easy to collect. Birch trees will often have excess bark that can easily be removed without hurting the tree. And number 4, my favorite reason for using birch bark is that it's flammable. The bark contains naturally occurring oil that can be ignited with little effort. Once the bark is ignited, the oil fuels the fire and holds the flame long enough for the kindling to take over. Take a look at how even the smallest strand of birch bark can easily be ignited with my fire steel. It is the oil in the birch bark which makes all the difference in cold and damp conditions. In a pinch, birch bark works when other tinders won't. This is yellow birch bark. And this is paper birch. Both species are excellent fire starters, although I do prefer using yellow birch. But beggars can't be choosers, so if I see a white birch, I'll use it. My next task was to gather a handful of white cedar leaves for my tea. Since cedars are coniferous, they will keep their leaves through the winter. And so when the moss is covered and the ferns finally wither under the weight of the snow, cedars will continue to add a splash of green to the landscape. Although most evergreens have needles, cedars have something that is sort of a hybrid between a needle and a leaf. Being a conifer, a white cedar's leaves remain green, but they're much softer to the touch than a needle, and when turned sideways, the cedar leaf is flat, much like a deciduous leaf is. Cedar leaves are certainly strange, but it's their unique design and texture that makes them easy to identify. With my birch bark in one hand and a handful of cedar in the other, I headed off to build a fire. Since the ground was wet, I laid down some kindling as a base. This will protect the fire from pulling moisture from the ground and being snuffed out. With the fire stabilized, I poured some water into a pot and added my handful of cedar leaves. Once the pot had come to a boil, I removed it from the fire and allowed it to steep for a few minutes. Continuing to boil the cedar would have destroyed a lot of the vitamin C that it contained, which is why I removed it as soon as it got to that point. After I had poured the tea into my mug, I did my best to skim the liquid off the top. Cedar contains a small amount of tannins, which will rise to the surface of the tea. Sometimes it can be seen as a very thin, floating film, which can easily be skimmed or poured off. Tannins taste bitter and can make some people's stomachs feel upset. However, I don't usually bother to remove the tannins because they don't bother me. But I do admit that my tea probably tastes better without it. If you have not tried white cedar tea before, I highly recommend it. It has a slight sweetness to it, and it tastes very similar to the way it smells. This may not be appetizing to some, but don't knock it till you try it.